I'll get her name. There's this, yeah,
Somebody from there, yeah.
yeah,
Maybe we should have a press freedom show. You and I could do it. You know
yeah,
what I mean? Like,
yeah.
put it out there. Just ask them what kind of bandwidth they have for these issues, because I think
Because after the layoffs, that's what Chris said, that we
yeah,
are trying to build something which is tuned into reportage and press, not press freedom. He said something very similar to that, to the
Well,
values of free press.
and they got rid of Brian Stelter, who was the person who owns that. I think that
Brian was doing a great
he was
job.
doing a great job, but I think that they felt like they could um, cut some costs, and some of those people that were let go were part of the old guard. You know,
Ah,
I think it was a mistake. Personally.
You guys can open it and pour it if you want.
Okay.
Just hide that bottle. Just hold it straight.
Here, I'll give you some. You talking to us? What's the name of the award that we got? Aubuchon?
mm-hmm.
John
John Aubuchon.
Aubuchon.
Yeah.
Because I got one of those a few years ago too.
I
So
know. They said that. They said that before.
I was really hoping that I could be there that night, but it was just
How's your wrist now?
it. It looks a lot worse than it is, but it's just designed to keep it immobile. I have a very small wound underneath here,
Right.
and I can't. I shouldn't lift anything, but I keep forgetting, and
How do you write? I mean, you write with your right hand, but
yeah,
still,
but
still
when I'm
you
typing,
need that.
so I take it off and just use my
Yeah.
slowly is is the answer.
Huh.
Yeah.
If you guys wouldn't mind, on the tables, if you could put your water.
Mm-hmm.
Hang on just a second.
Thanks so much. So we're just gonna have a conversation. You can ask me questions too.
Yeah, I would love to ask you questions. Is America going to be home for us now?
I don't know. I don't know. It's gonna be. I think America will endure whatever it is that we're going. Oh,
This sounds like.
where am I looking?
Right
Here.
here.
What about me?
3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Jason Rezaian. This afternoon, I have the great pleasure of speaking with my friend and colleague, 2022 John Aubuchon Press Freedom Award winner, Rana Ayyub. How are you, Rana?
I'm good, Jason. Thank you so much for this introduction. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. It's a wonderful opportunity to see you in person. Rana and I both write for the Washington Post for the Global Opinions section, which has long been a defender of not only press freedom but human rights around the world. And I was hoping that we could have a conversation today about some of the challenges you've been facing in covering your homeland.
Very interesting challenges, Jason, and I think nobody else would know that more than you, because I think we have a very interesting global opinion section at the Washington Post where most of the journalists and writers who work there are the ones who are considered anti-nationals by their respective countries. I mean, when I was getting the John Aubuchon honor 3 days ago, I said this. I said, what this award means to me is I feel seen and heard and respected at a time when your voice back home is not heard. You feel like a stranger in your own country, where you feel like very recently, I got a court summon for an article I wrote in 2009. It's probably, and the allegation against me is that I'm a practicing Muslim, hence prejudiced in my reportage, right? And of course, there are multiple other cases where I've been booked for a tweet where I'm allegedly inflaming communal tension in India. My appearance on a television channel on BBC has invited another case against me. There are money laundering charges. So name the charges and they exist. So,
for our general American audience, remind us what the official laws about expression are in India. They're quite similar to here in the United States. I mean, you're not doing anything. You're allowed to tweet in India. Am I correct?
I'm allowed to express myself with all the freedom. That is something the Constitution of India guarantees me.
Regardless of
race, color, religion, ethnicity, gender. I am a free citizen of my country, and hence it is my right as a citizen. It is also considered an act of patriotism to speak in the interest of my country, and that's exactly what I've been doing. That's exactly what I've done in my journalistic career, is to speak in the interest of the country and not in the interest of those in power. And strangely, we have conflated these two.
Isn't that what journalism is supposed to be all about?
It is, but like every other part of the world, we are now the enemies of the state because we are speaking a truth which those in power might not like as much as they wanted to.
Yeah.
It's not palatable to them. It's not popular because you are speaking a truth. I mean, when I won the Aubuchon Award, the comments in my Instagram and Twitter was like, "How does it feel selling your country?" Right? Very familiar, right? And so at this point of time, any reportage on India which is critical of the government is selling your country to the West.
So often, when journalists these days in democratic countries that are swinging authoritarian are accused of undermining national security or of peddling in fake news, what we're really saying is they're being critical of the people in power. I mean, is that a trend that you've seen beyond India in your travels over the last few years?
Absolutely. I mean, yesterday, I think Reporters Sans Frontiers released its Press Freedom Index, and India is again on the 150th position, if I'm not mistaken, for the world's largest democracy.
Yeah.
Home to the largest number of newspapers published.
More newspaper readers in India than citizens in the United States.
Citizens of the United States,
Yeah.
right? And what does then, in that case, one speak about a country where the Prime Minister of India, he came to power in 2014, has not taken a single press conference in the last 8 years. In an ideal world, the media, the robust Indian media, should have questioned him, hauled him over the coals, right?
Yeah.
But Mr. Modi, when he was just about to become the Prime Minister, when he was campaigning, in the only interview he gave to a very friendly news agency, he called critical journalists as news traders, right? And a year later, one of his senior ministers coined the term. I'm not sure if he coined the term or that's when he said it for the first time. He called us prostitutes, right? You coin. I mean, so that's how journalism and critical journalists and independent journalists are being viewed in the new world order ever since Modi has taken over as the Prime Minister of India. And yeah,
That term prostitute, I've heard that from friends and colleagues in the Philippines, in Hungary, here in the United States, now in India. One of the things that I'm most concerned about when it comes to press freedom in India and journalism generally is the number of journalists who have been killed doing their job. And I think as far as my reporting goes, we're talking about several dozen journalists in the last few years, the killers of these people have never been prosecuted, not one. And I think it speaks to a trend of dehumanizing people in this profession. Talk a bit about your experience of that in India.
I mean, to give an example, and I give that example very often, one of my colleagues, Gauri Lankesh, one of India's stellar journalists who was speaking against right-wing nationalism, pointing out to the hazards of radicalism. In 2016, when I published my book Gujarat Files, which is a tell-all story about me going undercover, she reached out to me saying, I want to translate the book in a regional language, in Kannada. And I said, you sure you want to take that risk, right?
Yeah.
She said, no, of course, we have to beat them. We have to tell the world what's happening. We have to tell people in India what's happening. And I remember there was some massive online campaign against me on social media, and she replied, she called me and said, I know what's happening to you. It's the state fan. She wrote on my Facebook, you are, don't worry, these are paper tigers. And next day, Gauri was shot dead outside her house in Bangalore, in one of the most cosmopolitan cities in India. And until today, we do not know who were the brains behind her murder.
Yeah.
Where is the trial headed? We do not know. I mean, the world was talking about Gauri Lankesh's murder. New York Times, Washington Post, every publication. Could the Prime Minister of India, who is so vocal on Twitter, who's so media savvy, who's so social media savvy, could he not post a tweet expressing his condolence on the murder of Gauri Lankesh and say, we are not going to tolerate this brazen attack on journalists? Another colleague, Siddiq Kapan, a journalist who was on his way to report a gang rape of a lower caste girl, he was stopped on the way and arrested for a story he did not report.
Wow.
For the last 2 years, he has been slapped with UAPA, which is a terror act. When the Supreme Court gave him bail in the case, I mean, I just tweeted about it yesterday. It's been 3 months. He has not been let out because the police has not completed the formalities of the bail. And then immediately they slapped money laundering charges against him, which is this new law which is being used against journalists, activists, dissenters. You're a critic of the government if a money laundering charge is pressed against you.
In India, have they codified, as they have in other countries, national security laws so that it can suspend due process for people who are faced with these charges?
The Indian Supreme Court has recently struck down sedition as sedition charges. That this is an archaic law that was used during the British invasion of India. We should strike this down. But what happens is we now have UAPA, which always existed, which is Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which has no clear definitions on who is an anti-national. So it basically gives the police and the agencies absolute power to decide who is an anti-national, to decide who acts against the national security of the country in that point. So we do not have specific guidelines on who could be a threat to the country at that point of time. It could be somebody who is critical of the government. It could be somebody who's putting out a tweet. That person could be an enemy of the state according to the national security officials. So I think we do not have any clear guidelines on that, but we have terror laws which deem any act of criticism in the present day as unpatriotic and an act of sedition, a war against the nation in present day India.
We've dealt with situations where press freedoms have been officially or unofficially rolled back in different countries around the world. situation in India is particularly dire, first and foremost because it is the world's biggest democracy, and it is very concerning what's happening there. Do you have hope of turning this around? Do you think that Indian democracy and freedom of expression will survive in your country? And if so, what's the prescription of getting it back?
I've been looking for those answers myself, Jason. I've been trying desperately for hope in a time when there is so much despair. When recently Gautam Adani, who is one of the biggest industrialists in India, is now the second richest man in the world, is almost on the verge of a hostile takeover of NDTV, the only independent news channel in India, right? So when you see the only bastions of free press being silenced, when you see the mainstream media in India towing the line of the regime, and when some of India's best known journalists and editors are now consultants or independent writers, I don't see any hope in the present day. I do have hope from these young journalists who are trying to find independent platforms like YouTube and Instagram, trying to tell their stories. But we live in a country where the Hindi media, which is the regional media, has more penetration in areas across the country where those news channels are peddling information which is misinformation, dog whistle against Muslims, and that is something which is accessible by a larger population in India. The ones like us, right, who write for the Washington Post, are probably are known to about 3 or 4% of the Indian population because we are more English reading, English hearing people, right? But a larger population in the country is a Hindi speaking or a regional language speaking population where the regional media has been completely co-opted by the present day regime. When our student activists who are speaking for love over hate are being arrested, where the government brings up draconian charges and the media just literally toes the line and parrots the line of the government, I don't see if I can look for hope. I was speaking about this to you earlier, right? I mean, I asked you, will you go back to Iran, right? Is there hope? And every time I used to look at you from a distance in India, right, I would think about it. How does it feel to be away from a country you love so much, a country you want to write on, right? And now when I'm here and a charge sheet has been filed against me and I go back to India to a very, very hostile government, not knowing if I can leave the country again, I feel like both of us are trying to look for that sliver of hope. It's just that it's not there right now.
It's not there right now, and it's not just you and me, and it's not just India and Iran. And I think it's so important that we dig deep on these issues because I think it's one of the defining human rights and democracy issues of this century. We all thought that the internet was going to be this wonderful space that would democratize information and news, but it's turning out to be weaponized as well against us. So I think we have to be incredibly vigilant about it. Talk to me a bit about solidarity with journalists from other countries and your experiences of being part of a community of journalists under threat, both at the Washington Post, but also less formally.
I think when I reached out to you, I think it must have been a couple of months ago when those cases were filed against me and we were on this Zoom call, right?
Yeah.
What these when I reached out, it was more to feel more to feel a sense of camaraderie, a sense of I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
There are others across the world who are fighting a similar battle, to feel less alone and to basically understand from you how should I deal with that situation, because you and Maria Ressa in Philippines, and there are so many out there, there's Patricia in Brazil, they're all fighting a similar battle. So when I meet them in journalism events, right, we all sit together and say, okay, how bad is it and how do you cope with it, right? Patricia was showing me this video of her image being morphed with leaders of the opposition. And I know that my image was morphed on a porn video. And I know that every time they have to silence me. There is a character assassination story, me sleeping with officials to get my story. There is a playbook.
Yeah.
It exists. That playbook exists where everybody, it feels like, are exchanging notes on how to target and silence journalists. So when I meet dissenters and journalists like you or Maria or Patricia, I feel less alone. And I keep, because I feel like, okay, when you're in India and this situation happens, you feel very lost.
Yep.
You feel like, why is everybody turning their back on me? Why is everybody going against me? But then I meet you and I meet other journalists. I get this sense of solidarity and an empathy which is otherwise missing. I feel like that empathy is missing across the board when I'm in India, with some really respectable exceptions, like my journalist friends in India who are now running independent platforms, who have had my back on days when I felt like I can't survive this, on days when I felt like I'm going to quit, on days when I felt like I need to give my life, I just can't survive this. When you have 3 full days of prime time television being dedicated to you and your family and everything, when you're made a free for all for this virtual lynch mob like social media, where you're trending every single day with the worst kind of charges, it helps to know that somebody else has gone through that and has survived and is still fighting an unpopular battle for the world.
Well, sometimes we have to ask ourselves why we're fighting those battles, and I think it's for the hope of freedom and democratic principles to exist long into the future.
But before you ask me, Jason, I'm going to ask you this question.
Sure.
Do you think when they see us as this brave, courageous figures, do they factor in that we're also human?
No, I don't. And I think that that's a big part of what I have, noticed for the last few years. When you have the opportunity to engage with these people, then they recognize your humanity. But when they are making these attacks, when they are planning these attacks, the intention is to destroy you. You touched on something just now, the threats of sexual violence and the ways that they have tried to smear you by creating, deep fakes. To me, that's an indication that they are not acknowledging your humanity. They see you as an obstacle. And I think we need to change that.
But what about the well-meaning who believe that we are brave and courageous, who expect us to fight this battle? Do they also realize that back home we also crumble sometimes, and we also miss our country, and we also miss the routine, normal life?
I hope that those people recognize that. Because the sacrifices that you make and that others make and that I was forced to make, I didn't choose my fate. It's very destructive, not only to your sense of well-being and where you stand in your profession, but your entire communities, your families, right? The children of your families. My wife and I have been dealing with threats against us since before we were arrested, during the time that we were in prison, since the time that we were in prison. Now we have a small child and we have, other things to think about. And so when those sorts of threats come through, it's just so painful, right? But as you said, there is this camaraderie and a playbook, and knowing that the playbook is not very imaginative and incredibly consistent.
Absolutely.
From one place to the next.
We're all funded by George Soros.
Yeah, exactly. Each and every one of us is funded by Uncle George.
Where are you, George Soros? I don't know. Where are you?
Yeah. So, it's we have to make light of it, because otherwise I don't think I would survive.
Yeah.
But the humanity of it and the dehumanizing is something that concerns me more than anything else. Because if you don't look at a rival or a nemesis or an adversary as human, then it's much easier to do the worst things imaginable to them.
Yeah.
And, you know, neither you nor I should be seen as an adversary,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We're just doing our job to tell the truth to communities of people who might not have access to it otherwise.
That's true. And the toll that you rightly said, the toll that it takes on your families. When they filed the case against me of money laundering, and the entire media for 3 full days was running a smear campaign against me and my family. It was my niece's birthday again, and she was trying to celebrate, and then we were always, and these television cameras were just knocking on the door. And when my niece opened, there was this birthday celebration. She had a couple of friends and said, oh, celebration is going on in her house when a case has been filed against her. And this time when a charge sheet was filed against me, my nephew opened the door. He's 5, he's turning 6, and they put the cameras on him and said, where is Rana Ayyub? I mean, I don't think they deserve this. I
No.
don't think for that matter, any human deserves this. But I feel like, some days I feel like, given a choice, would I really want them to go through this? Given a choice, does any journalist have to pay this price, or have to be brave and courageous for doing the reportage that they want to do? Do we want to revisit the terms brave and courageous that is being used for us? Because none of us have to be brave to be doing the reportage or writing the stories that we have to write, right?
No.
We just have to be normal human beings. We need to have a normal life like everybody else.
And that's often denied of us, right? And I think that the counter argument from a lot of people, especially people who don't agree with your writing, would be, well, then just stop. Why don't you just stop, Rana? If it's so terrible, just stop.
I know. I
You know?
really wish. I mean, but it's not even a choice, right?
Right.
It's more like, I mean, I personally feel like in my life I was never ever given a choice to do what I want to do or be where I am today. I mean, I got into journalism because in 2002, when Mr. Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat, the state where a genocide of Muslims took place, I happened to be there as a relief worker, and I had my own baggage of being a Muslim in India, where a mob has entered my house to pick me and my sister for a gang rape. And I kept seeing the patterns in a country which I called my own, which my ancestors chose over Pakistan during the partition of the country. And then I was looking at this own country of mine turning into a nightmare for me and many like me. And that's the reason I decided to be a journalist, because I felt helpless. I felt like I needed to tell this story because I have the language, I have the tools to tell that story. And at that point of time, I did not have the choice to do this or do that. Probably, yeah, I don't think I could have done anything else. It was because this was just driving me nuts.
Talk about your relationship with the Muslim community in India. I mean, how are they with you?
I don't know. I feel like I have never really thought of this line. I mean, yes, they do. They're appreciative of my efforts. The Muslim community, by and large, I mean, it's a 220 million Muslim population. It's not also, not everybody thinks alike.
Yeah.
Some of them believe that, everybody, some really respect my views. The others sometimes try to do moral policing when they see my Instagram feed.
Yeah.
Very recently, I posted a video of a Hindu festival, Diwali, where this woman really wanted to, do some Hindu ritual with me. And I posted that image on my social media because it was the India that I was raised in, where people coexisted irrespective of the religious divide. And when I posted that, I saw this outrage from the Muslim so-called, practitioners or custodians of faith, saying, how could you do that? This is a betrayal.
Yeah.
And I wanted to tell them, no, this is my personal life.
Yeah.
So yes, they have been appreciative of my work, but it's like this, right? One day you speak everybody wants you to be perfect.
Right.
Everybody, right? I'm not here to be their hero.
Right.
And I'm not here to be placed on a pedestal by them. I'm not doing this because I'm a Muslim. I'm doing this because I'm a human and I'm somebody who is sensitive to what's happening around me. So I see an attempt to place me on a pedestal and then expect a virtue that I do not have in me. I don't want to be a religious leader. I don't want to be a a leader of the faith. I don't want to be a role model for them. I just want to be me. And I feel like they are in a rush to make me a role model, because I realize, when a community is being thrown under the bus, 220 million strong community, right, of Muslims in India who are being targeted in their own country, and they're looking for moments of relief, saying, is somebody speaking for us? Because the media is not, the politicians are not, nobody's speaking for them. So when somebody keeps their issues on an international platform and speaks about the persecution, they end up treating them as heroes,
Right.
which I don't want to be. I'm not here to be anybody's hero. I just want to do my thing, do my journalism, do my public speaking, and leave and just go back to what I like doing and not be judged for it. So it is nice to be loved by them, but I do feel the sting of their judgment, which I don't think I deserve or I want.
I don't think you deserve it. I know you don't deserve it. You've been in the U.S. for a few months now. How's
Yeah.
that been? I mean, I know you've been here many times before, but you've been in a different capacity as a fellow at the University of Chicago. You've traveled around to different parts of the country. Talk about America in 2022.
I mean, this is the longest I've ever been away from home, probably the third month. I've never lived away from India for more than 4 weeks. As they call, I'm a desi, which is what the term that I love my people and I love the language and I love my food and I cannot stay away. So, but this time, I always have this, I feel like, no, this is not my country. America is not my country. I have to go home. But this time I wanted to give the US a chance, and Chicago, where I was for 2 months at the Institute of Politics, where I was a Pritzker Fellow, it gave me a chance to understand others and America at a time when it's going through also one of its more sensitive political and sociological times, right? To get a sense of what America thinks about India and the world, and what the students that I was teaching, what they thought. I felt, like I keep saying, I felt that these people respected me, especially when I was teaching. And the day I left the Institute of Politics, I got so many handwritten notes by students that made me feel at home, that made me feel like people are watching you, they're seeing you, you're not invisible, they see you. They see your fight. And the number of times I broke down this time at the IOP during my lectures, because there were students who were not grilling me, and there were people around me who were not looking to grill me. They were trying to also view me as a human being who is at great risk trying to tell a story. So America so far has been an interesting experience, and I'm here for another month, I think, unless the government of the day decides that no, she should just come back ASAP, because I do feel like, but also I do feel a dual standard towards human rights that I witness in the US.
What kind of interactions have you had with people in and around government that have maybe informed that feeling of a double standard?
I have met high-ranking officials in off-record conversations. And in off-record conversations, they are very worried about what's happening in India. They're extremely worried about the attack on Muslim minorities. They're extremely worried about the attack on journalists, and they ask, what should we do? What are the things that you suggest? When I'm away in India, there are things that they said, if you come here, should discuss this. But it's more talking than taking any action. Then they cite, when you confront them, they cite bilateral relationship. They cite the issue of China and Russia, so that we need India as an ally. We cannot speak about what's happening in India right now. Even the Western press, so to say, right? When I meet editors of internet publications here, of all the top newspapers, they meet me in private and say, "What's happening in India?" And I was like, I'm like, you have reporters in India, you know what's happening. I don't need to tell you what's happening. So I feel like there is a convenient amnesia over what's happening, because they've always viewed India as this country of, spiritual solace, meditation, yoga, that they refuse to acknowledge that it's also a country of 1.3 billion people. and the world's largest democracy, and people who are fighting for their fundamental rights. So it's tough to explain. It's exhausting to explain the situation, not just vis-a-vis me, but what about the students, about the politicians, about the attack on human rights in India. It's just like it's very exhausting to. It's like dealing with kids from a kindergarten, as if who know nothing, right? Who actually know everything, but pretend that they know nothing.
Right. Right. And at a moment when it's the largest democracy in the world, and its democracy is arguably under the greatest threat that it's ever experienced, if that 1.3 billion population democracy fails, that's going to be a huge problem for the United States and our allies to contend with for many years to come. So one would think that they would be more eager to act.
Right.
But you mentioned the bilateral relationship. Does a bilateral relationship trump everything else?
It looks like, but to give credit though, the U.S. Committee on Religious Freedom has mentioned India in its reports, where it has expressed its anguish and its fears of what's happening to the largest minority in India. Let's not forget that for the longest time, the U.S. did not give a visa to Modi to travel to America because of his role in the Gujarat genocide of Muslims. And let us not forget that very recently, the U.S. State Department, when they were asked about the immunity to MBS to travel to the U.S., they said, "Well, we also gave immunity to Modi."
Right.
So, so when they draw these comparisons between Modi and MBS, they know what they're talking about, right?
Yeah.
But it's not just about India. I mean, when Biden does this fist bump with MBS, after what happens to Jamal Khashoggi, you wonder if human rights really matter in the scheme of things, in the larger scheme of things. Do journalists like us matter in the scheme of things, or we can be sacrificed at the altar of bilateral relationships between countries? That is a question that needs to be asked. It does not have easy answers, but these are questions that are coming to the fore, especially vis-a-vis Shireen Abu Akleh, right? You see, in her life and her death, she exposed the dual standards of the white world on human rights. It's not the same what's happening in Palestine, what's happening vis-a-vis Israel. I mean, we don't talk about it as much, and there are dual standards that exist.
It's you said that should these things stand in the way, the bilateral relation, and if we're not going to hold our friends to account, whether it's democratic nations like India, Israel, or authoritarian dictatorships like Saudi Arabia, how can we expect countries like Iran or Russia or China to acquiesce to any of our demands? I don't think we can. So it would seem that getting on the right side of human rights is in everybody's best interest, but doesn't feel like that memo has made it across the street.
Not really. I don't think that memo has. I think that it has been promised to us, but you don't see it materialize. When you see them and confront them, they look the other way.
Yeah.
And you see that happening every single day. You see the same people who promise and talk about human rights and that we need to protect journalists look the other way when the journalists say, "Hey, now's the time to walk the talk." And you see them, and you see that every day. I mean, I see all these people who come on television and newspapers, talking about press freedom. I think press freedom has just become a myth, oftentimes a brand, something to be sold with products. I don't think people, I do value my association with the Washington Post, and I think we have, at the Washington Post, we have with Global Opinions and, the editorial section, we have opinion writers who are actually the ones, whether it's me, whether it's you, whether it's Jamal, whether it's Vladimir in Russia, we are persecuted, and which is why we get a platform. And we have been able to raise our words and raise our concerns and talk about an unpopular truth, as opposed to the cut and dry reportage that we see everywhere else in most publications. But that should not just be restricted to a few platforms.
Right.
It is the responsibility of every single person in the media to speak about press freedom, because we are just the messengers of the story.
Yeah.
We just happen to be the messengers of the story. The real problem lies we are telling the problem that could inflict the rest of the world. India has 1.3 billion people. If the Indian democracy goes down under, ripples will be felt across the world. It is not an India story in isolation. What's happening in India will happen in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in China. It just doesn't stay in, it's not an isolated case. So right now, if we are looking at a short-term solution saying, oh, because of the war, because of the Ukraine invasion, we need to keep our allies in check, we need to have allies vis-a-vis Russia. Are you then unleashing a Frankenstein monster at this point of time by ignoring them because it suits your interest right now to ignore their atrocities? So tomorrow, 10 years down the line, a Modi will be what a Putin is today.
Right.
And you have to take some accountability in creating that monster.
I don't think we'll ever take that accountability.
But
I take your point.
No, yeah.
I want to ask 2 more questions. One about how having that platform at the Washington Post has maybe changed your readership globally, right? How has it influenced who has access to your ideas? And can I hope that you'll continue to be with us for a while?
Inshallah to that.
Okay.
I really hope that you and I both continue our stint at the Washington Post, where we continue to have the platform that we have right now. Very few platforms, amongst the very few platforms that exist to speak a truth which is not very popular.
Right.
All right, which is not glossed with a color so that it's palatable to everybody. But joining the Washington Post has given me a wider audience. It has given me an audience. So I was widely read before I joined the Post, but when you have editors like I have at the Washington Post, where it's Eli Lopez, where we had Fred Hyatt, right? When these people come on board and they guide your writing, I think you become a better writer and you understand what should be written and what are the issues that matter. Washington Post has had my back on days when media in my own country just pretended that I didn't exist. Especially when the money laundering charges were pressed against me. The Post put a 1-page ad in the newspaper about stopping the attacks against me, right? So I really hope that support remains consistent, right? And because many of us persecuted journalists are looking up to the Washington Post, right? So I think that is something that needs to be cherished. And I think personally, for me, Washington Post now feels like home. It's not that journalists do not get offers, they do, but it feels like there's a comfort that I feel with the Post, right?
Yeah.
It has given me an editorial freedom that is rare in the times that we live in. That you don't have to self-censor. And that's probably what is afflicting journalism, that we are self-censoring ourselves to be seen as more acceptable. And before we are being censored by the government, we are self-censoring ourselves as publications. So far, there has been no self-censorship. And I hope, inshallah, to that it stays that way.
How important is it to have a publication have your back?
It is extremely important. I see what's happening to independent journalists across the world, right? Let's face it, there are journalists who are fighting a tougher battle than you and me everywhere across the world, who are incarcerated, who are killed and silenced. Nobody talks about them. You and I have, whether we like it, we have an access, we have a privilege that we are backed by these publications like the Washington Post. So it is a huge privilege. Unfortunately, it has also made us bigger targets of the governments where we come from, right? You and me, when we write about our respective countries, are made enemies of the state and enemies for Iran, for people in India. We are people who are besmirching the reputation of our countries, right? So I think on one hand, while it's hugely supportive to have a platform like this, it also makes us enemies in our respective countries where we are literally selling our soul to the Western publications. So I do often acknowledge my access, my privilege, and my social media clout that allows my persecution and the story of my persecution to be told to the rest of the world, where our stories are no longer local but are global stories that are now part of the press freedom narrative across the world.
And you've done that seamlessly, and I want to tell you that I appreciate how you use those platforms to highlight uh, the stresses and attacks on you, but others as well. I have one last very important question. You said that when you travel outside of India, one of the things you miss is your food. Um, you
It is a very important question.
we had, one of the most important regional dishes, a Maryland crab cake earlier today.
I loved it.
Was it good?
It was great. I
Um,
wish we didn't have to rush here. I'd have finished it otherwise. We'll go.
we'll owe you another one. But second, you have a special fondness for Ethiopian food, which is also a big DC tradition, large Ethiopian population here.
Right.
How did that happen? And how does that sort of tradition of finding Ethiopian food make your travels more interesting for you?
I think I've come to a point where every time I go to a new country or a new city, I look for an Ethiopian restaurant before I look for anything else, right? That's the level of my obsession. So I had a connecting flight from Addis Ababa, and I was just my flight was delayed, and I was hungry, and the other options were fast food and fries, etc. And I was not interested. And suddenly I see these guys at this Ethiopian restaurant enjoying this. I mean, it looked like they were really enjoying, and the bread that they had, the injera, was very similar to what we have in India, the dosa, right? It was it's when I tasted it, it's like fermented flour, right? So I love dosa. I eat dosa every single day of my existence. That's my obsession. Everybody in the last 3 months since I got here, everybody's like, let's get Rana dosa, right? That's my obsession. So I ate my first meal, and then I came back to India. I started looking for Ethiopian places. They didn't exist. We didn't have a single Ethiopian restaurant where I lived. So then every time I have to go to a different country, before I leave for that country, I do research on Ethiopian food in that state. I had something in Brussels, where I discovered there was a great Ethiopian place. I discovered Demera in Chicago. And here, I love this place called Glo Lalibela, which I discovered with one of my colleagues at the Washington Post. And you have given me a few options. And I feel like, most of the Uber drivers here, a lot of them are Ethiopian. So when I tell them about this obsession of mine, they say, what do you like? Isn't it similar to Indian food? And I love the food. And it so happens that every time I really like somebody, I like to take them out for an Ethiopian meal. If I really have fondness for somebody, if I like them, I respect them, the first thing I ask them, you want to join me for an Ethiopian meal? And I've taken some of the most phenomenal women I know for an Ethiopian meal.
Something about eating with your hands also
Absolutely.
is the connectivity of it.
Absolutely.
Is really nice.
Eating with your hand, the community eating, right?
Yeah.
One bread, one plate of bread, and two people eating from the same plate, right?
Yeah.
It is something that we in India do very often, right? We eat the thalis that we have,
Yep.
and people like to dig into from each other's plates. That community eating, it fosters a sense of belonging.
Really does.
There is something about that culture which it's very similar to my culture from India. And I feel like, when I go to these Ethiopian restaurants, they immediately make you feel like you're a part of them.
Yes.
You don't feel like an outsider. You feel like you've always been a part of them. I go to Glo Lalibela alone most of the times. I sit there and eat my dinner alone almost every alternate day. So one day she asked me, she said, do you really like Ethiopian food? I said, I love it. And so they come and sit with you and they say, can I sit with you? And they just chat. And it's beautiful. It's very rare to see that sense of acceptance, wanting to I enjoy Ethiopian food.
It's an incredibly warm culture.
It is.
They're dealing with their own challenges in Ethiopia
Absolutely.
right now. The press freedom situation there is one of the gravest in the world, matched maybe by neighboring Eritrea.
Yes.
But anything we can do to shine a spotlight on those
Absolutely.
countries, those cultures, those people, we will continue to do it. It's such a pleasure talking to you. I'm glad that we're able to do it in person finally. And I hope we have many more opportunities to do so in the years to come.
Inshallah to that, Jason. And inshallah, some days our countries will respect us and our choices and what we did for our countries, hopefully.
Or at least tolerate
Or
us.
at least tolerate us. Or at least stop calling us a nuisance. Thank you so much. Thank
It's
you
a
so much
pleasure.
for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We at the National Press Club appreciate you tuning in and look forward to seeing you again very soon. Have a wonderful day.
We're clear?
Yeah. Oh, brilliant.
Good, right?
That was seamless.
Fine.
I'm telling you, this will be our audition tape for CNN.